The Silverwood Arts District had a way of holding on to the light even on a cloudy afternoon. The old brick facades wore ivy like delicate lace, and the cobblestone streets hummed quietly under the distant sound of the L train rolling past. Inside a modest gallery, tucked between a used bookstore and a tiny cafe, Anya Moody stood alone, her hands adjusting the brass spotlight above her most personal piece, Silent Radiance. It wasn't the kind of painting that shouted for attention. Its colors were gentle, but deep swirls of muted gold broke through a charcoal graying storm. Anyone could see it was beautiful, but very few would understand. It was a map of her heart, the light she had lost, and the fragments she had tried to reclaim. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the varnished surface of the canvas. She straightened. The light stepped back and felt the stillness in her chest. For a moment, there was only her and the painting until... Footsteps. They came from the gallery's far end, slow and steady, echoing against the wooden floors. Whoever it was didn't speak at first. He moved like the room was his to take in, pausing before each painting, as though these were windows to places he'd never been invited before. Leo Smith. The name hadn't yet been spoken, but she recognized the quiet authority in how he carried himself. Shoulders back, gaze, deliberate suit, tailored to perfection. In that way, money could buy, but only discipline could maintain. His hair was the kind that caught the light and framed his face with an effortless precision. When he finally looked at her, it wasn't the glance of a man seeing a woman. It was the steady focus of someone deciding whether to step into an entirely different world. "You must be the artist," he said. His voice was warm, but carried a weight like someone used to being heard the first time he spoke. "Anya Moody," she replied, extending her hand without hesitation. "And I'm guessing you are more familiar with boardrooms than brushstrokes." The corner of his mouth lifted. "Leo Smith, CEO of Smith Innovations. But tonight, I'm just here as a curious man." "Curious." She arched an eyebrow. "Curiosity is good," she said, "but these paintings don't answer questions the way your technology does." He said that's what makes them dangerous moving toward Silent Radiance. You can't debug a feeling. He studied the piece, his eyes moving over the strokes as if searching for a pattern. "I want this one," he said suddenly. Her smile didn't waver, but her answer was immediate, "Not for sale." "Everything has a price." "This one doesn't," she said softly, "because I'm not ready to let go of what it's still holding." There was a pause, a small inhale stretching between them. Then she tilted her head. "But I could let it stay at your home for a while as a challenge." He chuckled, not in arrogance, but in a way that suggested she'd surprised him. "A challenge. To live with something you can't own," she said, "and see if it changes you." He disagreed, but didn't refuse. Just gave a single nod as if marking the moment for later. As the last guests filtered out that evening, Anya found herself standing where Leo had been earlier. She could almost see his silhouette in the fading light, not the billionaire in the suit, but the man who had looked into her painting and for a flicker of time hadn't looked away. It was unsettling. Over the next few weeks, he began to appear again, not with the city's noise on his heels, but with quiet intention. The entrance left a cup of coffee. A new easel carved from reclaimed walnut, delivered without a card, but with the kind of craftsmanship that told her he had paid attention when she once mentioned the feel of wood in her hands. When she mentioned that her work was invited to a Chicago exhibition, a plane ticket appeared in her mailbox, and a note was written in a surprisingly neat hand. "Fly there. Come back. I'll still be here." They didn't speak of love. They talked of color and code of the spaces between things. She told him about rainy mornings on the South Side, and how jazz through an open window felt like a second heartbeat. He told her about creating systems that connected people across oceans, though he never quite explained why his voice grew quieter when he said it. The world noticed. In the press, his visits were framed as eccentric. In his circle, people called it indulgence, a billionaire entertained by a starving artist. In hers, friends whispered, "He's white, wealthy, and corporate. How could he understand where you've come from?" But in the quiet corners of the gallery, none of that mattered. He listened in a way few ever had. And in his eyes, she was more than an artist. She was an entire gallery of light and shadow. The light shifted toward gold on the night he first came, which lingers just before the sun drops. Anya remembered how it touched his face and the slight crease between his brows as he studied her work. And though she had met many people who admired her art, none had made her feel like she was the canvas being studied. Before we continue, I'd like to pause and invite you, the ones listening now, to become part of this space Anya and Leo have just stepped into. Stories like this one breathe because of the people who carry them forward. So if you've felt even a flicker of connection in these moments, to the warmth of the gallery light, to the quiet daring of a woman who guards her truth, or to the unexpected shift in a man who thought he could buy anything, leave your thoughts in the comments. If you'd like to follow Anya and Leo's journey through their fractures, silences, and turning points, make sure you're with us for the next chapter. And if this first meeting made you pause even just a little, tap the like button. It's a small way to say, "I'm here. I'm listening." Because in this story, presence means everything. As Anya dimmed the gallery lights that night, the street outside was quiet, save for the soft hum of the train in the distance. She glanced once more at Silent Radiance, feeling the echo of his gaze on her skin. She didn't know then how much that single meeting would change the rhythm of her days, or that the man who had walked in wearing ambition like armor would one day have to choose between the world he had built and the one he never knew he wanted. For now, there was only the glow of the gallery, the whisper of rain beginning on the cobblestones, and the lingering thought of a challenge left unanswered. It was raining the first time Leo returned to the gallery after that night. Not the hurried rain that chases people into doorways, but a gentle drizzle that softened the city's edges. Anya was alone again, hair tucked into a scarf, and there was a smear of indigo paint on her cheek from a morning spent working on a commission. She glanced up when the door opened. He didn't speak. He walked toward the far end of the room, placing a cup of coffee black. No sugar, just the way she preferred, on the small table near her stool. "How did you know?" she asked, lifting it to her lips. "I pay attention," he replied, as if that were explanation enough. From then on, his visits never came with fanfare. Sometimes he stayed only long enough to ask about the colors she was mixing that day. He leaned quietly against the doorway other times, watching her work without comment. His presence became a quiet hum in the background of her days, unexpected at first, but eventually as natural as light through the windows. The city had its own opinion of their growing closeness. In the upper floors of glass-walled boardrooms, executives smirked over the idea of a billionaire tech mogul spending his evenings in a cramped art studio. They called it a phase the same way they might speak of an eccentric hobby, sailing, collecting rare wines, dating a painter. In Anya's circle, the whispers were softer but sharper. "He's from a different world," her friend Marissa warned one evening. "Men like him, they visit your life like tourists. They enjoy the view, but they don't stay." Anya had no answer to that. She only knew that when Leo stood beside her at the canvas, the air felt steady, as if it belonged to them. Leo spoke little about his work, but Anya pieced together fragments. The way his phone buzzed endlessly in his pocket. There is tension in his shoulders after specific calls, the occasional slip of technical language that rolled off his tongue before he caught himself. He surprised her as the last streaks of light caught on her palette one late afternoon. "I'm building something," he said. "A platform. It will change the way people connect. Connect how distance will matter less. Language will matter less. You'll speak, and the world will understand you instantly. She rinsed her brush, her eyes on the swirl of color in the jar. You think connection is about speed. He hesitated. And you don't. She said, connection is about the space between words, the silence where you choose to stay. He didn't argue. But that night as he left, she caught a look in his eyes, the faintest flicker of something unspoken, as if she'd touched a nerve without meaning to. Their rhythms began to weave together in ways that surprised them both. He would bring her breakfast on the mornings he knew she worked late. She would send him photos of an unfinished piece when she sensed he'd had a long day. One evening, she found a new easel waiting in the gallery carved from warm walnut, the grain smooth beneath her fingers. It was taller, sturdier, built for someone who intended to create without interruption. She knew instantly it was from him. Why, she asked when she saw him next. You mentioned yours was unstable. That was months ago. He shrugged. I remembered. When her work was invited to an exhibition in Chicago, she hesitated. The travel would cost more than she had in reserve. She didn't tell him. Yet 2 days later, a plane ticket arrived in her mailbox, along with a note. Fly there. Come back. I'll still be here. She kept the ticket tucked inside her sketchbook. She never said thank you. Some things were better left as shared understandings. But even in the warmth between them, shadows lingered. Their worlds were built on opposite foundations, hers on stillness, his on velocity. He measured time in minutes, sometimes seconds. She counted in brush strokes in the slow drying of paint. At first, the difference was easy to ignore, but small moments began to reveal the gap. The night of her Southside solo exhibition, the one she'd spent 6 months preparing for, she waited for him. She imagined him walking in quietly, as he did at the gallery, with eyes that would make her forget the crowd. Instead, he arrived nearly an hour late, flanked by 3 young associates in sharp suits, their laughter filling the space before he did. He was still on a call as he entered, nodding distractedly at the paintings before heading her way. You made it, she said. Of course, he answered, giving her shoulder a brief squeeze before turning to introduce one of his companions. Throughout the evening, he drifted between groups, speaking in a language of deals and deadlines, his attention caught by a world that had nothing to do with the art around him. When it was over, they stepped outside into the cool night. You came, she said quietly, but you weren't present. He stopped walking. I'm building a future for both of us, Anya. Why can't you see that? Her fingers tightened around the scarf at her neck, a future I'm meant to watch from the sidelines. They didn't fight. They didn't raise their voices. But something between them shifted that night, like a seam coming loose in a favorite coat, not enough to tear it apart, but enough to feel the draft. Still, the days went on. He returned to his skyscraper office. She returned to her studio. Their meetings became less frequent, but the quiet was still there when they happened, waiting for them. Yet in the quiet corners of her mind, Anya began to notice things she hadn't before. The way he constantly checked his watch. The way his gaze would wander when she spoke for too long. The way she stopped asking when he'd be back. She told herself it was just a phase, that all love went through seasons. But one rainy evening would prove otherwise. It was late, and she left an exhibition earlier than planned. The rain had started to fall harder, drumming against her umbrella. No taxi stopped. When she reached Lakeview Avenue, her coat was soaked and her boots were heavy with water. She opened the apartment door to find him at the desk, his face lit by the cold glow of the laptop. He didn't look up. You're back, he said. You're not going to ask why I came home early. He continued typing. You must have had a reason. You're not the type to leave halfway. She stood there for a long moment, the water dripping from her coat pooling at her feet. In the space between them, something small and fragile cracked. The following week passed without much change, but the air between them felt different. Their conversations narrowed to schedules and small details. He spoke of meetings. She spoke of deliveries. They began to live side by side rather than together. One night, a picture frame fell from the shelf. She picked it up carefully, but he sighed before she could set it down. "Do you know how much I love every minute I sit here?" he said almost absently. The words cut in a way he didn't seem to notice. She set the frame back on the shelf, her hands steady. "Then stay there," she said quietly. "Return to your world measured in minutes. I count in presence." It wasn't anger. It was clarity. She turned away for the first time since they'd met without looking back. As she lay awake that night, Anya realized she could no longer pretend they were walking toward the same place. And though she hadn't yet decided, the first goodbye threads were already forming in her hands. The first frost arrived early that year in downtown Chicago. It slipped across the streets at dawn, sheathing car windows in delicate lace, making every breath visible. Anya stood at the wide apartment window on Lakeview Avenue, watching the steam curl from the mugs of hurried commuters below. Behind her, Leo's voice, carried from the bedroom low, clipped the kind of tone he reserved for calls that couldn't be interrupted. Once, she might have lingered to listen, curious about the weight of the negotiations that commanded him. Now she turned away before the conversation could filter into her thoughts. She wrapped her scarf tighter and reached for the small suitcase she'd kept near the door for weeks, its presence a silent reminder of the decision taking root inside her. In the weeks since that rainy night, the gap between them had widened, not with the violence of a break, but with the slow erosion of tide against stone. Their mornings no longer began together. Their evenings rarely ended in the same room. She had stopped waiting for him to come home. He had stopped noticing when she didn't. The night before, they'd shared a meal in silence. She had made roasted chicken with rosemary and lemon, as he used to like. He ate without comment, his phone resting face down beside his plate, as if that counted as presence. When he finally looked up, he mentioned a trip to Silicon Harbor for another round of investor meetings. She nodded, neither asking how long nor offering to come along. While the frost clung to the rooftops that morning, she gathered her canvases. Each one had its place in her life, its own story. She wrapped them in soft fabric, tucking them into the back of the suitcase with her brushes palette and the smaller jar of cobalt pigment she had been saving for a future project. She didn't leave a note. She didn't need to. Words had become an insufficient currency between them, unable to purchase the understanding she once believed they shared. The last thing she took was her sketchbook. Inside its worn cover was a single folded piece of paper, the plane ticket he had given her for Chicago, the note that said, "Fly there. Come back. I'll still be here." She kept it not out of sentiment, but because it reminded her of a time when the promise felt true. Anya didn't go back to her childhood home in the South Side. She couldn't bear the familiar streets, the questions from neighbors, the knowing looks. Instead, she booked a one-way ticket to Asheville, North Carolina, a city tucked in the mountains where the pace was slower, the air softer, and anonymity was a kindness she could accept. The flight was quiet. She sat by the window, her fingers resting against the faint swell of her abdomen. She hadn't told anyone yet, not Leo, Marissa, or herself. But she knew. And though fear whispered at the edges of her thoughts, it was accompanied by something else, a steady, surprising peace. She rented a small apartment in Asheville, with sunlit windows and creaking wooden floors. The kitchen was barely large enough for two people to stand in, but the living room had a perfect corner for her easel. From her balcony, she could see the blue ridges of the mountains in the distance, their outlines fading into mist each morning. The first months of pregnancy were brutal. Nausea came like waves, and the nights were long and restless. She would wake at 3 a.m., staring at the street lamp below, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. But in those moments, she wasn't entirely alone. At her first ultrasound, the doctor's smile widened. "There are 3 heartbeats," she said. "Triplets." Anya had laughed in disbelief, the sound breaking into tears halfway. 3 lives. 3 pieces of a love that had ended, but left something immeasurable behind. She named them in her mind long before they were born. Eli, the quiet one whose eyes she imagined would carry depth, like the deep end of the lake. Micah, who would fill the room with laughter, was stubborn as sunlight pushed through clouds. And Arya the dreamer, the only girl with eyes she knew, would mirror Leo's in a way that would one day stop her. The seasons turned slowly. She worked part-time at a community art center, teaching children to mix colors and see shapes beyond the obvious. She took commissions when she could, painting portraits of local families and landscapes for the cafes nearby. The work was modest, but it was hers, and it kept the 3 little lives within her nourished and safe. By the time they were born, Asheville had become home. The first loud and insistent cry came from Micah, followed by Eli's softer, almost questioning wail. Arya emerged last, her tiny hands curling into fists, her eyes opening just long enough to catch the light. Anya wept not from pain, but from the staggering truth that they were here, that she had brought them into the world without fanfare, without the man who had unknowingly given them life. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Leo's life showed no visible fracture. The headlines still praised his vision. Deals still closed. His name still carried the weight of inevitability. If he thought of Anya, it was fleeting, like a fragment of color in a dream gone before he could hold it. In rare moments, something would pull at him, the smell of turpentine in an old studio, the particular curve of light on a street in winter. But he never went looking for her, and because he didn't, he never knew what had changed. 3 years passed. The triplets grew into their small constellation of personalities. Eli watched the world with the patience of someone twice his age, often content to build small towers from blocks or sit beside Anya while she painted. Micah was a blur of motion, his laughter constantly rippling in their apartment. Arya loved to draw crude but earnest sketches of mountains, flowers, and sometimes of a tall man holding the hands of 3 children. Anya never asked who the man was in Arya's drawings. She didn't need to. One quiet winter afternoon, the past found its way to her door. It came as a thick white envelope with no return address, the kind of paper that spoke of money and ceremony. She slid it open with the edge of a palette knife and unfolded the card inside. Leo Smith and Isabel Crawford request the honor of your presence at Ravenwood Manor, Asheville Hills, on December 25th for their wedding celebration. Her breath caught. She hadn't thought of him in months, not consciously anyway, but something ancient stirred at the sight of his name. It wasn't longing. It wasn't even anger. It was the weight of unfinished truth. As the triplets played on the floor that evening, Arya crawled into her lap with a sketch pad. "Look, Mama," she said, drawing a man in a suit with 3 children beside him. "Who is this?" Anya asked, her voice steady. "I dreamed about him," Arya said. "He looks like Eli and Micah. And me." Anya traced a finger along the lines of the drawing. "Some bonds," she murmured, "don't need explaining. They always find their way." That night she sat by the window, the city quiet under a thin veil of snow. In the reflection of the glass, she saw herself older, perhaps a little more weathered, but not broken. She thought of the years that had passed without a word between them, the 3 small faces that looked up at her each morning, and the man who had never known they existed. Her decision, when it came, was not born from bitterness. She would attend the wedding, not to disrupt or demand, but to place the truth in his hands where it belonged. What he did with it afterward was no longer hers to decide. Christmas morning in Asheville Hills broke beneath a veil of silver clouds. The air smelled faintly of pine and frost, the cold that seemed to settle in the bones before the day began. Anya stood before the mirror in her bedroom, smoothing the fabric of the navy blue dress she had saved for months to afford. It was neither extravagant nor understated, a quiet kind of elegance that drew the eye only after a second glance. Her hair was pulled into a soft knot, a few curls left to frame her face. She applied lipstick in a muted shade of rose, enough to soften the edges of her composure. In the living room, the children waited. Arya twirled in a small white dress trimmed with lace, her curls bouncing with each spin. Micah adjusted his bow tie for the third time, expressing excitement and curiosity. In a pale gray suit, Eli sat still on the couch, his small hands folded as though he sensed the weight of the day ahead. "Mom," Micah piped up as she stepped into the room. "Who will we see?" Anya knelt, so her eyes met theirs. "Someone you've asked about before," she said softly. "Today is his special day. But we're not going to stir things up. We're going because of the truth. That's all." The three nodded, not because they fully understood, but because they trusted her. Ravenwood Manor stood at the crest of a hill, its white stone facade gleaming against the pale winter light. Beyond the tall iron gates, the lawn unfurled in endless green, dotted with white floral arches draped in satin ribbons. A classical quartet played softly under a heated canopy, their music weaving through the hum of conversation. Inside the grand hall, guests in tailored suits and shimmering dresses mingled, exchanging laughter and glasses of champagne. Entrepreneurs, artists, media personalities, people who knew Leo Smith by name and reputation, though perhaps not by the truths he kept close. Anya and the children stepped inside quietly, her presence cloaked in the poise she had cultivated over years of solitude. At first, no one noticed them. But then, as the children drifted a step forward, heads began to turn. It started with one pair of eyes catching on Arya's face, the distinctive hazel green that had been Leo's since childhood. Then the whispers began, a murmur at the edge of the crowd. "Who is she? Those children." Micah tugged lightly at her hand, sensing the shift in the air. Eli glanced up at her, silent but watchful. Across the room, near the arched doors leading to the garden, Leo stood beside Isabel Crawford, his bride-to-be, a poised figure in an ivory gown. His smile was fixed in place, his posture effortlessly confident, until his gaze swept across the hall and locked on Anya. For a heartbeat, his expression did not change, and then slowly, the composure faltered. She stood still, her chin lifted, the children close at her sides. Arya tilted her head as if seeing something she had only imagined until now. The music faltered, a note slipping out of rhythm. The murmur in the room swelled. Leo excused himself from Isabel's side, his stride cutting cleanly through the crowd. He stopped a pace away from them, his eyes moving from Anya to each of the children. He lingered longest on Arya, the mirror of his gaze staring back at him. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low, not in anger, but in something heavier, fear, disbelief, a dawning recognition. Anya knelt, taking Arya's small hand and placing it in his. "They're your children," she said. "I'm not here for justice. I came to return the truth." It was an explosion without sound. The air itself seemed to tighten. Isabel, still near the archway, froze as realization dawned. A single tear tracked down her cheek before she turned away the train of her gown, whispering against the marble as she left the hall. Leo knelt slowly, his eyes level with Micah's, then Eli's. Micah's voice came first, quiet but firm. "Are you our dad?" Eli said nothing, his hand tightening protectively around Arya's. Arya's question was softer, but landed like a stone in still water. "If that's true, then why weren't you there?" No answer formed on his lips. For all the years he had commanded rooms, negotiated empires, and shaped visions of the future, there was no script for this moment. No Harvard lecture, no market strategy had prepared him for the weight of three small voices and the truth they carried. Anya's voice was steady when she spoke again. "You don't have to do anything. We'll go. But if one day you want to be a part of their lives, you'll know where to start." She turned, guiding the children toward the exit. Micah glanced back once, as if memorizing the look on Leo's face. Arya kept her eyes forward. Eli didn't let go of his sister's hand. The celebration dissolved into fragments. Guests stood in clusters. Their conversations muted their eyes, tracking the space where the scene had unfolded. The music had stopped altogether. Leo remained where he was, long after the doors had closed behind Anya. Not because he didn't know what to do next, but because for the first time in years, he could feel the precise shape of something he had lost, and it was unlike any loss he had ever known. That night, the penthouse in downtown Chicago was quieter than usual. Leo sat in the darkened living room, the city's winter lights spilling through the tall glass windows. The unopened bottle of wine from the reception sat on the table beside him. His phone lay in his hand, heavy with hesitation. He thought of Arya's eyes, Micah's guarded question, Eli's silence. He thought of Anya's voice, not accusing, not bitter, but resolute. By midnight, the weight of the stillness became unbearable. He dialed the number he had not called in years. It rang 4 times before she answered. "Hello," she said, her voice low-edged with the softness of someone who had just put children to bed. "It's me," he said quietly. "Leo." There was a pause. "Why did you come today?" she asked. "Because He stopped, the practiced language of persuasion failing him. "Because I don't want the children to grow up in the dark. They have the right to know." Her reply was steady. "You didn't listen. I tried to tell you. I wrote. I called. But when someone chooses ambition, there's no space left for any other signal." His hand tightened around the phone. "If I had known," she cut in gently. "Are you asking to soothe yourself or to begin truly?" The question stilled him. It was the kind of question you could only answer by living it. Finally, he said, "I don't know. I know I don't want to lose them. Not because of what they give me, but because I need to become the man they deserve." On the other end, he heard her exhale. "The kids will be at the park near home at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. If you want to begin, don't come to apologize. Come to listen. I'll be there," he said. And this time he meant it. The park was still wrapped in the pale mist of morning when Leo arrived. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and pine's sharp, clean scent. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the rustle of bare branches whispered overhead. He was 15 minutes early, but he didn't mind. For once, there was no meeting to rush to, no flight to catch. He'd chosen a dark wool coat over a navy sweater, no tie, no tailored formality. His shoes sank slightly into the frost-hardened grass as he crossed toward the small playground. Anya was already there. She sat on a weathered bench, her scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, a paperback open in her lap. Her gaze wasn't on the pages, though. She was watching the children. Eli stood by the swings, testing the chains with small, deliberate pulls, before sitting and letting the seat sway gently beneath him. Micah was on the slide, his energy darting between climbing the steps and sprinting to the jungle gym. Arya knelt in the sandbox, drawing shapes in the cold sand with a stick, her curls catching the thin light of the sun. Anya glanced up when she saw him, her face unreadable. She closed her book and stood brushing off the back of her coat. She didn't walk toward him. She didn't need to. This was his step to take. Leo approached slowly, his gaze flicking from one child to the next. He felt strangely unsteady, as if one wrong word might undo the fragile permission she'd given him. Eli noticed him first. The boy didn't run, smile, or frown. He watched his dark eyes assessing patient in a way that felt far too old for his years. Arya looked up next, her hand pausing mid-line in the sand. She hesitated, then gave the most minor wave, almost shy. Micah came last, turning mid-climb, his brows knitting in quick suspicion, before curiosity softened them. "Morning," Leo said quietly, his voice careful, as if speaking too loudly might scare them away. Micah tilted his head. "You're the man from the big house. That's one way to put it." Leo replied, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "But today, I'm just Leo." Anya's voice carried lightly from the bench. "He's here to listen, whatever you want to say." He started with Arya. He crouched down so his eyes met hers. "What are you drawing?" "A dragon," she said, brushing the sand with her stick. "But not a scary one. This one's nice." "I like friendly dragons," he answered. "They're rarer than you think." Her lips twitched, not quite a smile, but not far from it. Micah hopped down from the slide, brushing his hands on his pants. "Can you draw one?" Leo shook his head lightly. "Not well. I'm better with machines than dragons." Micah's eyes narrowed, testing him. "What kind of machines?" "The kind that helps people talk to each other, even if they're far away." Micah considered this for a moment, then pointed at Arya's dragon. "You could learn. Everyone should know how to draw a dragon." Eli hadn't moved from the swing. Leo walked toward him, stopping a step away. "You like building things?" he asked. The boy's eyes flicked up. "Why, I saw the robot on your porch. The one made from soda cans and wire." Eli's grip tightened on the chains. "That's mine." "I figured," Leo said softly. "It's smart. The arms work better than I thought they would." A faint flicker of pride crossed the boy's face before he masked it. "It's not done." "Neither am I," Leo replied. Eli didn't smile, but his gaze held Leo's for a beat longer before he looked away, pushing off gently with his feet to make the swing move. They stayed like that for over an hour. No grand gestures, no attempts at instant connection. Leo played catch with Micah using a worn rubber ball from the sandbox, listened to Arya explain the story behind each of her drawings, and sat beside Eli, offering ideas for the next iteration of his robot without touching a single piece. Anya watched from the bench, her book untouched. She noticed the way he didn't force himself into their games and asked questions without turning them into lectures. He seemed smaller somehow, not in stature, but in presence, stripped of the weight he used to carry like a second skin. When the children grew restless, Anya stood time to head home. Leo didn't protest. He nodded, as if understanding that trust was measured in minutes like these, built one morning at a time. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. In the second week, he came again, same time, same coat, sometimes with an old comic book tucked under his arm. He'd sit on the bench, letting Micah read over his shoulder, while Arya colored in the margins, and Eli listened without looking up from his building projects. By the third week, he asked Anya if he could attend their parent-teacher conference. She agreed with a reminder, "You don't need to make up for the past. Just be consistent." At the school, he sat quietly at the back of the classroom while the teacher spoke about each child. She said Arya often helped her friends, but hid her worries, so they wouldn't be troubled. Micah didn't like coloring inside the lines. Eli had no interest in sports, but could spend hours constructing intricate designs from recycled scraps. Leo wrote each detail in a small notebook, not to fix them, but to remember. Anya noticed the changes, though she didn't say so. She saw how Arya began looking for him at the park, how Micah started bringing his questions about machines, how Eli's guarded silences were interrupted by small, cautious comments. One afternoon, rain tapped lightly against the windows as Leo sat cross-legged on the living room floor, helping Arya piece together a puzzle. "Uncle Leo," she said suddenly. "Yes, if you keep coming like this. Would you want me to call you Dad?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her then, Eli on the couch, and Micah fiddling with a dismantled toy truck. "When you're ready," he said at last. "And if your mom says it's okay." From the kitchen, Anya heard him. She didn't turn or speak, but something inside her eased the easing that comes when someone proves they're willing to wait. A week later, he surprised them all. The evening before Arya's school play, she left a note on his desk in her uneven handwriting. "Tomorrow night, I'll be Snow White. I'm scared I'll forget my lines. Please don't laugh. Look for me in the crowd wave when you see me." Leo's flight to Singapore was confirmed the next morning, a $300 million deal waiting on the other side. But the note sat on his desk, quiet and insistent. That night, as the school's makeshift stage lights flickered, the door to the auditorium creaked open. Leo slipped in, rain still on his coat, breathless from the sprint. He found a seat in the front row, just as Arya stepped onto the stage in her handmade white dress. Her eyes searched the crowd wide and nervous until they landed on him. He raised his hand in a small, steady wave, his fist curling once in silent encouragement. She smiled, the tremor in her shoulders easing. She stumbled over a line halfway through, but when she looked back at him, his slight nod was enough to keep her voice steady. When the curtain closed, the children spilled out from backstage, Micah with a paper bouquet, Eli clutching the video camera, and Arya, still in costume, rushing into his arms. "I did it," she whispered against his shoulder. For the first time in years, Leo felt something solid and whole settle in his chest. Not the thrill of a deal closed, but the quiet gravity of being exactly where he needed to be. The rain had not stopped when Leo carried Arya to the car. It came in fine silver threads, soft enough to miss the windows, but steady enough to blur the glow of the street lamps. Micah slid into the back seat with the paper bouquet still in his lap, its edges curling under the damp air. Eli held the camcorder carefully, like it was something rare, a record of a moment he didn't want anyone to lose. Anya stood under the school's awning, her coat pulled close. She didn't move toward the car immediately. Instead, she watched Leo, how he buckled Arya's seatbelt without rushing, adjusted Micah's jacket so the collar didn't press against his neck, and asked Eli if the camera was safe from the rain. When he finally shut the door and turned toward her, she stepped forward just enough to speak without raising her voice. "You missed your meeting," she said. "I can sign other contracts," he replied, "but Arya will only have her first leading role once." Her expression didn't soften right away, but her voice had no resistance. "We'll see you tomorrow." He nodded, a small thread of relief running through him, though he didn't show it. That night in his penthouse, Leo stood in front of the mirror. His tie was still in place, his shirt pressed as if he had walked out of a meeting instead of a school play. But the damp cuffs of his sleeves told another story. On the table by the door sat his travel suitcase, which he had packed for Singapore. Beside it lay the stack of files for the Klex Corporation deal, the $300 million agreement that had been months in the making. His assistant had called twice, each time with a slightly sharper edge. "The board is waiting. The partners are waiting." But what echoed in his mind wasn't the language of mergers and projections. It was Arya's voice, small but sure. I did it. In the morning, he made a decision. He arrived at the office 2 hours before the rest of the executive team, standing in the center of the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city. It had the same view he'd admired for years, but looked smaller somehow. When his vice president Cameron Shaw entered with the final contract, Leo didn't take the pen. "I'm stepping down," he said. Cameron blinked. "From the deal. From the company." The words hung in the air. "You've built this empire for 15 years, Cameron said slowly. "And you're walking away now." "I'm not walking away," Leo replied. "I'm walking towards something else." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. By noon, the boardroom was buzzing with speculation. The press office was drafting its statement, and the markets were breathing. That afternoon, he drove to Asheville without calling first. He parked near Anya's building, a modest brick apartment complex with sun-faded awnings and flower pots lining the balconies. He sat in the car, momentarily watching the second-floor window that he knew belonged to her unit. A pale curtain fluttered against the glass. When he finally knocked, Anya answered, her hair pulled back, a faint smudge of charcoal on her wrist. She looked at him long before stepping aside to let him in. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and drying paint. The children were scattered across the living room. Arya was coloring at the table. Micah was sprawled on the floor with building blocks, and Eli was crouched by the half-assembled model robot by the window. "I resigned," Leo said, his voice even. Anya glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "From what?" "From all of it." Her gaze sharpened. "Because of last night." "Because of last night," he admitted. "And every moment I've missed before it." They didn't talk about it further. Instead, he took off his coat and sat on the floor beside Micah, asking how the towers were supposed to fit together. Eli moved a few pieces toward him without comment, and Arya came over to show him her newest drawing, a stage, a dragon in the corner, and 4 stick figures holding hands. He didn't ask if one of them was meant to be him. He just studied it and nodded, his throat tightening in a way he hadn't expected. Over the following weeks, Leo settled into a new kind of life. He rented a house just a few streets from the children's school. Nothing like the towering penthouse in Chicago. Its rooms were modest, its windows opening onto a small garden with frost-hardened soil. He began working as a strategic consultant, choosing projects that allowed him to control his hours. It wasn't seamless. He made mistakes forgetting to pack Micah's extra shoes for Jim overcooking pasta, until it clumped and breaking the zipper on Arya's coat when he tried to fix it. But he learned quickly, listening when Anya offered suggestions, adjusting without protest. The children began to shift around him. Arya stopped asking if he was coming to the park. She began assuming he would. Micah brought him problems to solve, a Lego bridge that wouldn't hold a puzzle missing a piece. Eli, still cautious, began leaving his robots on the kitchen table where Leo might see them, as if granting quiet permission to look. One evening, near the end of January, Anya stood in the kitchen rinsing paint from her hands. Leo was at the table with the children, helping Arya read her lines for another school project, while Micah practiced his spelling and Eli sketched a design for a new robot. When the children went to brush their teeth, she joined him at the table, drying her hands on a towel. "You're doing well," she said. He looked at her, waiting for the qualifier that didn't come. "Not because you're trying," she added, "but because you're present." The words landed with a weight he didn't try to deflect. He only nodded, the faintest smile touching his mouth. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep, he stepped out onto the small balcony. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs, but he didn't mind. From here, he could see the faint outline of the mountains against the dark sky. Inside the apartment was warm, filled with the quiet hum of a home that didn't yet call him a fixture, but no longer saw him as a stranger. He thought of the years he had spent chasing acquisitions, negotiating against impossible odds, fighting for inches in a world that measured worth in millions. And he realized that nothing in those rooms of glass and steel had ever felt as fragile or as worth protecting as the laughter he'd heard in this apartment tonight. By the time February came, the rhythm had settled. Leo dropped the children off at school some mornings, stayed for dinner some evenings, and learned the slow patience of bedtime routines. He and Anya didn't talk about the future explicitly, but there was a quiet truce between them, an understanding that whatever came next would be deliberately built. Some nights, she still left a cup of coffee by his door before dawn, the steam curling into the cold air. She never said it was from her, but he knew, and he took it in his hands each time with the same quiet gratitude. Leo wasn't measuring his life by quarterly reports or market growth for the first time in years. He was measuring it in smaller, stranger increments, the number of steps between his rented house and the school. The minutes it took Arya to fall asleep after a story, the way Eli's answers to his questions grew from one word to two. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't instant. But it was real, and for the first time, that was enough. March came quietly to Asheville, the mountains still wearing their winter skin, the trees holding tight to bare branches. But the days had grown longer, and the light through Anya's windows shifted warmer now, spilling across the wooden floors like a slow promise. Leo had become part of that light. He wasn't in every room every hour, but his presence was threaded into the days in a way that felt settled. He walked the children to school when his schedule allowed, lingered in the kitchen to help with breakfast, dropped by in the evenings with groceries he claimed were on sale even when they weren't. Anya never asked him to come, and she never asked him to stay. Yet he did often enough that his absence began to feel like something noticed, not just by the children, but by her. One Thursday evening, she was in the kitchen, stirring a soup pot, when she heard the front door open. She didn't need to look to know it was him. The soft thud of his shoes on the mat was familiar now. "You're early," she said without turning. He replied that the meeting ended sooner than I expected, setting a bag on the counter. The scent of fresh bread drifted from it. I stopped by the bakery on the corner. She ladled soup into bowls while he sliced the bread. It was an ordinary rhythm, but there was an ease in it that made her pause, the kind of ease she remembered from years ago, before the fracture, before silence became their shared language. After dinner, the children scattered Micah to the living room with his Legos, Arya to her room, to draw Eli to the small desk by the window where he tinkered with his latest robot. Anya stayed at the table, sketchbook, open pencil, moving in quiet arcs. Leo watched her from across the room, the lamplight catching on the faint smudge of graphite on her fingertips. He said, "You still draw like you're listening to something no one else can hear." She didn't look up. "That's because I am." "What is it?" "The part of me that stays quiet until the world slows down." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I used to think silence meant something was missing. Now, it's the opposite." That earned him the faintest curve of her lips. Not quite a smile, but close enough to stir something profound in his chest. The night wore on. The children drifted toward their bedtime routines, but Leo didn't leave. Leo offered without hesitation when Micah appeared in the hallway, rubbing his eyes and asking for a story. He sat on the floor beside the bed, spinning a tale about a boy who built a flying machine out of tin cans and string. Arya crept in halfway through, curling up at the foot of the bed, listening without a word. From the doorway, Eli stayed longer than he had meant to, his hands shoved in his pockets, but his gaze was fixed on the storyteller. When the story ended, and 3 sets of eyelids grew heavy, Anya stood in the hall, watching. Something about the scene, his voice low, his hands animated, the quiet trust in the room reached into her in a way she hadn't prepared for. Later, when the apartment was still, she found him in the kitchen rinsing the mugs they'd used earlier. "You don't have to do that," she said. He shrugged. "I want to." Her hand brushed his when she reached for a plate, and they both paused. The contact was brief, but the air shifted subtle. Charged, a thread pulled tight. "You've changed," she said quietly. "Maybe I just stopped running," he replied. She searched his face for a moment before stepping back. "Don't promise what you can't keep, Leo. They've already learned too much about absence." His jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "I'm not promising. I'm showing up." In the days that followed, small moments kept unfolding unscripted, but carrying the weight of something that might grow, if they let it. On a rainy Saturday, he sat with her at the kitchen table, the two sharing coffee, while the children built a fort out of blankets in the living room. Their knees brushed under the table, and neither moved away. One afternoon at the park, he brushed a leaf from her hair without thinking, his hand lingering a beat too long. She looked at him then, and there was no shield in her gaze, no sharp edge. And once late in the evening, when she was working on a painting in her studio corner, he stood in the doorway for a long time before speaking. "That one feels different," he said. "It is," she murmured. "I don't know if it's finished yet. Maybe it's not supposed to be." But the question remained unspoken between them. Were they building a fragile bridge for the children, or was something else, something old and unfinished, finding its way back into the light? The uncertainty was both a comfort and a danger. One night, as she walked him to the door, the children were already asleep, and he hesitated before stepping into the hall. "You know," he said, "when I first saw you at the gallery, I thought the hardest thing would be convincing you to trust me. And now I think the hardest thing will be convincing you to let me stay, not for them, but for you." She said nothing, only holding his gaze for a long moment before closing the door. But her hand lingered on the knob afterward, the echo of his words settling in her chest like a pebble dropped into still water. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. In her mind, she saw the life they had once shared, brief, flawed, but alive with an intensity she hadn't felt since. And then she saw the man he was now, quieter, less polished, but more present. The question stayed with her, restless, unanswered. The next morning, she found a cup of coffee on the counter when she woke, steam curling into the soft light of dawn. There was no note, no knock on the door, just the quiet offering, warm and waiting. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she took a sip, and the taste carried comfort and possibility for the first time in a long time. It happened on an ordinary Friday evening. The late light over Asheville was honey gold, settling in slanted beams through the tall shop-front windows on Main Street. Anya had just finished picking up art supplies from a small boutique and held Arya's hand while Micah and Eli trailed behind, arguing quietly about whether robots could beat dragons in a race. Leo had offered to meet them there after wrapping up a consulting session nearby. He appeared at the end of the block, his coat open, the easy confidence in his stride softened by the faintest smile when he saw them. "Hey!" he said, bending to scoop Micah up in a quick swing that made the boy laugh before ruffling Eli's hair and catching Arya in a one-armed hug. It was so natural, the five of them standing there talking over one another, deciding where to go for dinner, that none noticed the pair of women stepping out of the cafe across the street. Not until their voices carried. "That's Leo Smith." One whispered, not as quietly as she thought. With her, the other made a sound between disbelief and disdain. You'd think after the Crawford engagement scandal he'd stay in his lane. Anya's fingers tightened slightly around Arya's. She kept walking, but her shoulders had gone still. Inside the restaurant, the warmth and chatter wrapped around them, but the comment lingered. Leo noticed that Anya's gaze was fixed on the menu without reading it. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. She looked up, her expression calm but guarded. "Depends on your definition." He leaned back, studying her. "What happened?" "Nothing. I haven't heard before," she said, closing the menu. "Some people can't imagine the two of us existing in the same frame unless it's a headline." He frowned. "Anya, I'm not telling you because I want comfort." She interrupted, her voice low enough that the children busy with their crayons couldn't hear. "I'm telling you because the world hasn't forgotten who you were, and they've already decided who I am." His jaw tightened, but his tone stayed even. "They don't get to decide anything about us." "Maybe not for you," she replied, "but for me and them, it's different." Dinner passed in a quieter rhythm than usual. The children didn't notice. They were too busy sharing bites of pasta and swapping jokes. Only they seemed to understand. But Leo saw that Anya kept her posture perfectly straight, and her laugh came half a beat late, as if pulled from her rather than given freely. When the meal was over and the kids had run ahead to the car, he touched her arm lightly before they stepped outside. "I don't care what anyone says," he told her. She met his eyes, her own steady. "You think that's enough. But you've never had to live in the crosshairs of those whispers. You've never had to prove you belong in spaces that don't want you there." His throat tightened around the reply he wanted to give, that he could take it and shield her from it, but something in her gaze told him that wasn't what she needed to hear. So he just nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that he understood more than he could fix. The following week, the weight of that night seemed to linger between them unspoken. Yet life moved forward in its small, steady ways. On Tuesday, Leo arrived at the apartment to find Arya and Micah sprawled on the floor drawing, while Eli tinkered with a small motor. Anya was at the kitchen counter, wiping her hands on a towel, her hair pulled back loosely. "I'm making tea," she said without looking up. "Do you want some?" "Yes," he said, stepping inside. He hadn't mentioned that he'd thought about her words from the restaurant daily since then. Later that evening, after the children were in bed, they ended up in the living room together. She was curled in the armchair with a book, her legs tucked beneath her. He sat on the couch absently, spinning a pencil between his fingers. "You were right," he said suddenly. She looked up. "About what?" "That night. At dinner." She closed the book. "I wasn't trying to be right." "I know. But I've been thinking about how I can walk into a room and not even register how people look at me. And you've spent your whole life walking in prepared to fight for the right to stay." Her eyes searched his face, as if measuring whether the words were reflex or something more profound. "And what does that change for you?" she asked. "It means I don't get to pretend my presence doesn't affect yours, that I can exist here without thinking about what it costs you." For a moment, the air between them felt fragile, like the pause before a confession. But instead of stepping closer, she leaned back into her chair. "Awareness is a start, but it's not the whole thing." The following weekend, they took the children to a community fair on the edge of town. There were stalls selling handmade crafts, the smell of kettle corn drifting over the grass, and a small stage where local musicians played under strings of lights. Anya wandered with Arya between the booths, while Leo helped Micah and Eli try their hands at a ring toss. Occasionally someone would glance their way, some with curiosity, others with faint recognition. It wasn't the open stairs of the city, but it was enough to keep her aware of every inch between them. He handed her a paper cone of roasted chestnuts when they regrouped by the food stalls. "For you," he said. She took it, their fingers brushing briefly. And just like that, something shifted. Not because the space around them had changed, but because for that moment, it felt like they were the only ones inside it. That night, after the children had fallen asleep in the back seat on the drive home, Anya glanced sideways at him. The dashboard lights traced the lines of his face, the quiet focus in his eyes, as he navigated the winding roads. "You were different today," she said. He raised a brow. "How so?" "You didn't shrink when people looked." "I'm not here to shrink," he said. "Not anymore." The answer came without hesitation, and it lingered in the small space between them long after they pulled up outside her building. When the children were tucked in, she found him still in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of water. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not making me feel alone in it today." He set the glass down, closing the distance between them until they were only a step apart. "You've never been alone in it, Anya, even when I didn't know how to show it." Her breath caught, not because the words were unexpected, but because they carried the weight of a truth he hadn't been able to speak before. And for the first time since the wedding at Ravenwood Manor, she let herself imagine only for a moment what it might be like if the space between them wasn't just for the children, but for them. It began with the rain, a heavy, relentless downpour that seemed to press the whole town into silence. By late afternoon, the streets of Asheville were slick with water gutters overflowing. Anya stood at the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea. The children were in their rooms. Arya humming quietly over a drawing. Micah sorting Lego pieces by color. Eli bent over his workbench with a small screwdriver. It had been a long week at the Community Arts Center. Budgets were tight, and the director had pulled her aside yesterday, his voice low with the kind of hesitation people use when they know they're delivering bad news. They were cutting back hours for part-time staff. Her classes would be reduced by nearly half. She'd smiled, then told him she understood, but its weight had settled overnight, pressing into her chest. Teaching wasn't just income, but a tether to the life she'd rebuilt here. Without it, she would be left with unpredictable and unstable commissions that came in fits and starts. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Leo was there, rain on his coat hair damp at the edges. He held a bag from the market in one hand, the other tucked into his pocket. "You look tired," he said gently. She stepped aside to let him in. "It's been a week." He set the bag on the counter and began unpacking fresh bred tomatoes, a bundle of herbs, and inexplicably a small jar of her favorite honey. "What happened?" he asked, glancing at her over his shoulder. She hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "The center's cutting my hours, more than I expected." He stopped what he was doing, turning fully toward her. "Anya." "It's fine," she said quickly, the word sharper than she meant. "I'll figure it out." "Fine usually means the opposite," he replied quietly. As he stepped closer, the rain softened to a steady patter against the windows. "What do you need?" "Not a bailout," she said before he could speak again. "That's not what I was offering." His voice was calm without the edge of pride she used to hear when he tried to solve things with money. "What do you need?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. The truth was simple, but saying it felt like peeling back a layer she'd kept covered for years. "I need to feel like I'm not losing my footing again." He nodded once, as if he understood exactly what she meant. Over dinner, he kept the conversation light, pulling the children into stories about when he and his brother tried to build a go-kart out of scrap metal. Arya giggled until she nearly dropped her fork. Micah leaned in so close he almost knocked over his water glass. Even Eli looked up from his plate, eyes bright with questions about the design. Anya watched from across the table. He wasn't trying to distract her, but in a way he was not with denial, but with presence. After the dishes were cleared and the children had gone to bed, she found him in the living room, leafing through one of Arya's sketch pads. "You're good with them," she said. He looked up. "They make it easy, When the apartment was quiet again, he stood to leave, but she stopped him at the door. She said, "I'm not used to letting anyone stand in the gap with me." "You don't have to be used to it," he replied. "You have to let it happen." Her breath caught at the simplicity of it. He didn't press. He didn't offer solutions wrapped in contracts or grand gestures. He was just there. And in that moment, it felt like enough. The next morning, the rain had cleared, but the air was still heavy with it. She woke to find a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was unmistakably his. "Meet me at the studio at 10. Her first thought was to ignore it. She had commissions to finish, errands to run. But curiosity, stubborn as it was, pulled her toward the address she knew was his rented workspace, a few blocks away. When she arrived, the smell of sawdust and coffee met her at the door. Inside, he was setting up a long table, the surface covered in brushes, sketch pads, and jars of paint. "What is this?" she asked. "A space," he said. "For you. For them." She stepped closer, running her fingers over the grain of the table. "The art center cuts your hours, so we make our own. You teach here. Kids from the neighborhood, our kids, whoever shows up. No schedules. Someone else controls, no budgets. Someone else cuts." She stared at him, the weight of the offer pressing in. "Is it that easy?" "No," he said, "but it's worth trying." Over the next week, she did try. The first day, it was just Arya and Micah, their friends from school, and Eli with his quiet concentration. The second day, a neighbor brought her niece. By the end of the week, the room was filled with laughter, the walls lined with drying paintings and half-finished clay sculptures. Leo didn't hover, but he was there, fixing a broken stool, running to the supply shop when they ran out of paper, making sure the coffee pot was always full. It wasn't the same as the art center, but it was hers. The space breathed differently, as if the walls recognized it was built from choice, not necessity. One evening, as she was cleaning brushes, she felt him watching her from across the room. "You're smiling," he said. She looked up, startled to realize she was. "I am." "Good," he murmured. Something in his gaze, then steady, unguarded, made her heartbeat quicken. She looked away, focusing on the jar in her hands. The street was quiet when they locked up that night, lamplight pooling on the wet pavement. He walked her and the children to their building, his hand brushing hers once lightly as they reached the door. She didn't pull away. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For knowing what to offer and what not to." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Some things you learn the hard way." She held his gaze a heartbeat longer before turning the key in the lock. And as she stepped inside, she realized the ground beneath her felt a little steadier than it had the week before. Not because her hours had returned, or because she had solved everything, but because someone else had chosen to stand in the rain with her until it passed. Spring in Asheville arrived not in a single day, but in fragments. A patch of sunlight on the pavement, a warm gust through an open window, the faint smell of earth waking beneath the grass. By mid-April, the trees along Main Street had begun to bud, their branches dusted with green that seemed to catch every bit of light. The small studio Leo had found for Anya was thriving in its way. On Saturday mornings, children crowded around the long table, smocks tied crookedly, their hands smeared with paint. The air was full of laughter and the faint tang of turpentine. Anya moved among them with an ease that came from more than skill, from belonging. Leo was there most days, though never in the center. He fixed a stubborn window latch, replaced the flickering light in the corner, and restocked brushes without being asked. He never made it about him, but the studio seemed to breathe easier when he was there. One evening, after the last child had left and the door was locked, she found him standing by the big window at the front, looking out at the street where the lamps had just flickered on. Lost in thought, she asked, setting the brushes into jars to soak. He turned, a half-smile touching his mouth. Maybe. Just thinking how fast this place became. Something. She wiped her hands on a rag. It's not the art center. It doesn't have a budget or a board. But it's mine. It's ours, he corrected gently. The words hung in the space between them, soft but sure. They left together, the air cool with the last breath of winter. The children were with a neighbor for the evening, giving the walk back a quietness they weren't used to. The streets were nearly empty, their footsteps echoing against the brick facades. Halfway to her building, the rain began light at first, then heavier, dotting the sidewalk in uneven patterns. They ducked beneath an overhang outside a closed cafe. She smoothed the damp from her hair, glancing at him. We could wait it out. Or we could keep walking, he said, his eyes steady on hers. She hesitated, then shook her head with a faint laugh. Always the one to push forward. And you, he said quietly, always the one worth following. The words weren't planned, but they landed between them with the weight of something long unspoken. The rain thickened, drumming against the awning. She wrapped her arms loosely across her chest, more from habit than chill. He reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. His hand lingered there, his thumb resting at the edge of her jaw. He said, "This doesn't have to be just for them." His voice low. "It can be for us, too." Her breath caught. "Leo." "You don't have to answer now," he murmured. "But I wanted you to know, I'm not just showing up for them anymore." She didn't pull away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, the rain wrapping them in a private shelter. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But the way she looked at him, steady, unguarded, was an answer. The rain had eased to a fine mist when they reached her building. Inside, the apartment was warm and dim, the soft glow from the kitchen spilling into the hall. She set the kettle on, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who needed a moment to gather her thoughts. He leaned against the counter, watching her. "You've changed," he said softly. "So have you." They didn't speak for a while, the kettle filling the silence with its slow rising hum. When it whistled, she poured 2 mugs, sliding one toward him. "To what we're building," he said, lifting the cup slightly. She clinked hers against it, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. "To what we chose." Later, after he'd gone, she stood by the window. The city's lights reflected faintly in the glass. She thought of the years between them, the fracture, the silence, the 3 small lives that had bridged the distance. She thought of the studio, the laughter that filled it, the way he had stepped into her world, not to change it, but to hold it steady. And she knew, even without saying it aloud, that something had shifted. If you've been here since the beginning, from the gallery lights in Silverwood to this quiet, rain-soaked night, you've felt each step with them. Maybe you've even seen parts of your own story in theirs, the leaving, the return, the small, careful ways people choose each other again. If you have, share it. Tell us in the comments the moment in this journey that stayed with you. And if you want to see where Leo and Anya's story goes next, stay close. Their next choice might change everything.